Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashley Hong, and I'm a second-year law student and cybersecurity service scholar here at NYU Law. It's my pleasure to introduce our next panel, Weaponizing Reality, Cross-Industry Threats and Abuse of People, Organizations, and Fundamental Trust. When we talk about weaponizing reality, we're referring to developments that are already showing up in practice. Companies are losing significant amounts of money to AI-enabled impersonation scams, synthetic identities are bypassing verification systems, and extremely realistic deepfakes are being used not only in targeted fraud, but also to manipulate markets, democratic processes, and public perception. Today's panel will focus on how organizations across sectors are addressing these issues directly, both operationally in terms of detecting synthetic activity, training staff and partners, and anticipating regulations, and also in deciding where and how to intervene while still allowing space for legitimate use and managing trade-offs around enforcement and business impact. From the technology platform side, we have David Bleeden, Senior Director of Trust and Safety and Responsible AI at Google. Dave leads work on AI safety and platform integrity, including efforts around misinformation, elections, and other forms of misuse. From the financial services sector, we have Dave Suchman, Senior Vice President and Head of Global Financial Crime and Customer Protection at PayPal. Dave's work oversees fraud prevention and customer security, including working with regulatory expectations around identity verification. We're also joined by Wasim Khaled, CEO and co-founder of Blackbird AI. Wasim works on identifying and analyzing narrative-based threats, including coordinated misinformation, bot-driven manipulation, and risks to brand, markets, and public perception. We were originally scheduled to be joined by Andrew Lamarca and Tanya Ugoretz, who unfortunately are no longer able to join us today. And this discussion will be moderated by Erez Lieberman, partner at Debevoise and Plimpton, who advises organizations on how to incorporate these kinds of risks into planning, response, and governance. And with that, I'll turn it over to Erez to begin the discussion.
Thank you very much. Very much. I'm delighted to be here, and we'll turn to the panelists so we hear from our experts momentarily. I, however, was struck by yesterday's Duke loss and suspect that so many Duke fans wish that that was a deep fake. I, on the other hand, am going to watch the reality of that again and again and again as a Virginia fan. But we have been dealing with deepfakes a lot on behalf of our clients. In particular, the North Korean IT worker scheme has been incorporating deepfakes into a lot of their application process. We have seen deepfakes carrying out to commit business email compromise and just the ease of proliferation. And we now incorporate them into our tabletop exercises. The most recent one we did last week was a perfect deepfake that one of our associates generated in an hour. And truly, it was a perfect deepfake of the CEO. Luckily, we stuck some jokes in there to make it clear that it wasn't him, because the general counsel almost had a heart attack when he saw it and said, "You guys have to delete this immediately. Imagine if this gets out. It looks just like our CEO." And mission accomplished with our tabletop. He gets the point of why these are such a dangerous element. And I think that that's not even the beginning of it. The worst case scenarios are certainly on some of the public aspects of this online. But I want to actually, that's my first question to our esteemed panel. And maybe I start with, we're going to go with Dave on the far left and David next to me. So we have Dave, Wasim, and David. Dave, on my far left, why don't we start with you? How do you see the different impact of deepfakes in your line of work as a kind of our opening question here?
Cool. Is this okay? Great. Yeah. So first off, thanks for having us. It's always great to meet folks in the community that are equally concerned and interested in deepfakes and how we get ahead of them and mitigate them. So I've been in an organization called Trust and Safety, been at Google for longer, but Trust and Safety for 8 years. And up until recently, the last couple of years, Trust and Safety was very focused on sort of what I would call traditional trust and safety work, which would be abuse across all of Google's surfaces, including scams, fraud, information quality, elections integrity. Actually led the elections team a couple of years ago, among other things. And so in those roles, we were very specific about, very invested in thinking about deepfakes from a distribution channel. And so how are they showing up on platforms like YouTube, search, the news corpus, et cetera, and what do we do about it? I would say about 2 years ago, or a little longer than that, there was an acceleration, obviously, with this AI moment that we're in, and this organization that I'm a part of evolved to also focus on trust and safety work when it comes to our models and products themselves. So what are the rules for what our products should be and our models should be willing to output, especially when it comes to image generation, video generation. How should we think about sort of users that come with sensitive queries, where they're coming with conspiratorial thinking, and what should be the appropriate model response there? As well as, now that our models are generating content, it obviously enhances all of the work that we're doing on the distribution side. How do we think about things like content moderation when it's much harder to detect deepfakes, and the bad actors that are trying to use deepfakes for malicious purposes just have more powerful tools at their fingertips. And so the team that I lead right now, I focus, is called Responsible AI. It's part of this trust and safety organization. Part of my team focuses on governance, and so how do we make sure that we systematically launch responsible models and products. I have a big part of my team is focused on testing, and so how do we test both for sort of known risks, but also unstructured tests, so a lot of red teaming, a lot of sort of novel testing when it comes to how do we test for the technical frontier, personalized agents, for instance, as something that we're spending a lot of time on. And then I have a team under me that's focused on what we call our AI strategy, a neutrality pod, a fairness pod, but then also a bunch of folks that work on provenance. They'll lead our Google provenance approach. You heard from Andy Parsons earlier, and so my team was also the team that worked on Google's C2PA partnership. Our decision to join as a SteerCo member for the schema, along with some of our proprietary technology, and then also the policy team. So how do we also set, again, the rules of the road for what our models should be and products should be willing to output?
Dave, you seem to have amazing experience and breadth. What's the worst kind of threat that you've seen from deepfakes that has made you say, wow, real problem nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really concerned about voice cloning in particular. Face, like you can, for instance, right now, currently use a lot of AI lab technologies to do image generation, video generation of identifiable people, but that coupled with voice cloning is where we see a heightened risk when it comes to things like scams. There's obviously concerns with even just image generation using somebody's likeness, but likeness plus voice is where you see sort of the more egregious scams, fraud, attempts at fraud, et cetera, that I'm sure the other panelists are experiencing themselves.
Yeah, well, Wasim, why don't we turn to you? You guys and your company have we were talking about some of the broader elements of this. How do you think of the deepfake threat fitting into the broader environment?
Yeah, so we do come at this from a little bit of a different angle in that a deepfake or a piece of like digital synthetic media, whether it's video or imagery, becomes kind of one prong within the payload of what we call like a narrative attack. And so a narrative attack is when there is an adversarial actor or actors that are trying to create a campaign that creates pressure within an organization, distort perception. And from our perspective, deepfake could be one of the endpoints that would create a perception manipulation campaign against a particular group of people, or it could be an entire country. So our approach here is, if you understand the propagation pattern of that narrative attack through information networks. So say you have a deepfake and you have it attached to a narrative that is trying to create some sort of financial, reputational, operational form of harm, then being able to trace all of that together, the bot network that might also be propping that narrative up, and of course, deepfakes, because they are visual, being like a tip of the spear in driving that narrative forward and recruiting more people into that particular mindset. And so for us, I think we do analyze the pixels and we have our own models to look at deepfake imagery, but it is about what is the impact of that piece of synthetic media tied to the piece of messaging and the narrative attack that is actually being driven forward. And so our customer base ranges from national security, NATO is one of our largest customers. We're looking at geopolitical events that might have narrative attacks that are driving perception around those. Or it could be from Fortune 500 perspective, what is the brand reputation should a image of, say, a CEO get out there? What is the impact across, say, market price, audiences, et cetera, so that brand reputation? It's all about measuring the impact of that narrative attack, and deepfakes are a bigger and more growing component of that.
Fantastic, and certainly love the idea. This is just one aspect of a broader narrative attack. David, let me turn to you. You're in the financial services sector, highly regulated. Every regulator is asking about this now. How are you all thinking about this threat?
Yeah, I feel like these two guys set the table really nicely for the problems then that we have to encounter every day. So I work at PayPal and have been there just about 9.5 years. I was a prosecutor before that for many years. So this is like two areas kind of coming together because you can't prosecute your way out of this crime that's being perpetuated. When you look at a platform like PayPal's, we are processing millions and millions of transactions every single day. So the scale that Wasim is kind of referencing is what the challenge is for compliance programs that have to navigate this advent of technology and how it's being utilized for fraudulent purposes. So just to kind of start, let me do a little compliance nerd for a minute to help kind of frame. And Joe Facciapacci sitting over there, I sit on the compliance program board, advisory board here at NYU also. So this is two areas really coming together. Because for us, we have to think about our KYC obligations. That's your know your customer obligations, regulatory burdens, right? Those are really table stakes for running a compliance program. If we're going to be then inundated with deepfakes and the imagery of deepfakes, that is not a fraud control, it's a regulatory control and a regulatory speed bump that we have to meet. So if we're getting inundated with those, and then you're also thinking about how you use that technology or you use an ID as part of your fraud control environment, you're kind of getting hit in two separate vectors. It's two parts of your program, your risk programs. So we are really navigating this at scale because the scaled attacks that Wasim is referencing are testing all of your controls over and over and over again to find a weakness or a weak point, and then trying to flood that weak point. So if you're using, for example, a tethered ID product, right, which is your product where you're tethering your face, a selfie, to an actual identification. If you're using that for both your KYC obligation potentially and a fraud control, you're getting hit on both sides of your program. You could have a loss event. At the same time, you're having a regulatory event, as well. So that is what we are trying to face and navigate. And when you're doing this at scale, it's not about a onesie twosie, obviously. It's how do you deploy the right technologies to fight the AI that is coming at you and keep that current and keep that current and keep that current. And how do you do that at scale? That's the challenge that we're actually facing. And it is a massive piece of work and a massive risk for every single company that is trying to navigate this kind of space. And regulators understand that it's a risk, but they don't necessarily understand the technology behind it and how big a problem it is.
And no doubt, and we don't really have any regulations yet to pin to on these deep fakes. We're starting to see some, right, in reaction to some events. My hometown had Westfield, New Jersey, has been in the press, unfortunately, for some deep fakes generated by a high school student of other high school students being nude, and they were deep fakes. And so we saw some court action against that, and then the state of New Jersey reacting with a law against generating some of that. But that's in a very specific use case. David, I want to come back to you in the financial services context. When we work on data breaches and people overtake MFA, take over the device or the password, we say, look, the way to secure yourself then is the help desk needs to jump on a live video call with the user, and only then they can authenticate. But deepfakes are going to come back at that. How are we going to work on security? And I want to open that up to the panel as a whole. How are we going to work on security if we can no longer rely on one of our last lines of defense, which is the actual identity?
Yeah, that is the scale problem also. There are different regulations across the world. For example, in India, it is a eKYC type environment, which is mandated. Other countries have different regulations about where you need to meet. This is a multi-pronged approach at this point because you really can't fight your way out of the deepfake environment and think that's going to be the one thing that's going to get you. You really have to start looking at every piece of telemetry that you have coming in and how much data you have coming in. Everything from device ID, patterns, every fingerprint that you can get off of a transaction or a user. You're really having to bring every part of your program together now to say there's an anomaly here and I'm seeing it. How you clear them through it becomes the challenge in this environment. But what we are finding is, as a large institution, it's data availability at the end of the day, being able to aggregate your data and understand your customers in a way that is deeper than just one piece of data that you may be getting. That's the way we're looking at this, is we have to bring as much as we can together. The other piece is the vendor community. We are a technology company, so we are developing our own strategies on this. I'm sure Google is doing the same, probably at scale. but the vendor community plays a really, really large role, with us. And what I'm finding right now, Wasim, I'd love your comments on this. I'm not moderating, but I would love your comments on this. Is we are finding the vendor community to be slower at kind of being able to deploy the strategies that we need to really fight the attacks in the moment. So when we're moving into an incident management opportunity where we're getting hit by a large scale attack and we're seeing what's coming at us, we're often giving feedback to the vendor community as fast as we can to say, well, what do you have that can deploy against this? And they're often saying, thank you for the learning. Now we're going to go back and see what we can develop. So it's really this iteration between your own company's resourcing and then how you work with the right vendor community to get them, at scale to deploy the pieces that you need to stop the attack.
Wasim, I want to turn to you on that because you were tagged, but also I failed to read this language so we're going to start the whole panel over. The panel has been approved to offer one New York State CLE credit in the category of cybersecurity, privacy, and data protection general. As a reminder, anyone seeking CLE credit must sign in and out of the CLE attendance sheet at the registration table. That's outside. We can fake the first few minutes if you need. Noting both time of arrival and time of departure, we cannot issue credit to attendees who do not provide their signature upon arrival and again upon departure. Sorry that I didn't read that earlier. Also, Mariana went out when I read that, so that doesn't count. Wasim, back to you. How do you think of us being able to combat this if this was our last line of defense?
So, we are actually talking to PayPal. Funny that we should talk after this, but I would say this, right? So we find ourselves at least our company Blackbird finds ourselves at the nexus of different groups within the organization that are trying to understand the problem of deepfakes, narrative manipulation, disinformation in different ways. So there is your strategic comms, there is your cybersecurity, there is your legal, and of course there is your public affairs and other teams that are all impacted in different ways by these types of risks. You mentioned incident response, so I'll stick to that for a moment here. And our company was just at RSA, which is a cybersecurity conference that was last week, and cybersecurity teams have always thought of narrative as something that is the comms team's problem, right? And I think there are a lot of people within the organization that think maybe deepfakes and anything that is related to that kind of incident, it's somebody else's problem, right? Because there is not an identified buyer or someone who is designed to solve that issue. And what I've told a lot of these teams, I actually told like 1,000 CISOs this last week, which was, this is a whole of company problem because a deepfake or narrative attack can hit a company's public stock price by 15, 20%. So the cost of your average threat intelligence breach is $4 million, but Budweiser gets hit by a narrative campaign and it costs them about $20 billion in market cap, moves them from number 1 to number 9, and I believe they're now at number 7. They never fully came back from that. A narrative attack is outsized, and a deepfake of the CEO saying something he didn't really say is outsized compared to their typical incident management, incident response attack surface. So from an incident response perspective, one thing that we've been relaying to C-suites and incident managers is, if the narrative, what people believe, outpaces what you can technically validate within your organization, then you have to change the order in which you actually manage those incidents to actually be very forward in saying, okay, we have technically validated that this particular thing is not true, is true. It's the, you hear about pre-bunking, but this is actually changing your kind of executive priorities based on what the public believes. And you could apply this to anti-financial crime. You could apply this to like a merger. We have seen on the eve of a merger, a narrative attack that drove massive amounts of, say, FAA complaints around a particular airline, preventing that merger from taking place with someone short selling on the other side of it, using a social media campaign as the medium for that. Those are things that you don't find out until it's far too late. And so to really every executive team or anyone who is managing incidents, if you're not actually measuring what the public believes about your organization, then you're really, really on the back foot, and most people don't have the telemetry to actually see that in time. And so it is being proactive, and I'm seeing more and more Fortune 500s be proactive in this space. But even 2 years ago, it was waiting until they get hit. I know they were talking about this. A gentleman from Pfizer was saying, most organizations wait until someone in their peer group gets slammed massively, and then they go on the hunt for maybe tools and teams that can deal with this. I don't think it's one that that operators should really wait on.
I agree 100%. There's no time like the present, and certainly AI is fueling and the cause of these deep fakes, and was the topic of all. I was out there too at RSAC last week. Dave, I want to come to you with all these deep fakes and our inability to really detect these. As I said, I thought that our deep fake that we generated in an hour, an associated an hour of executive, was spot on. I wouldn't have been able to tell the difference, and the real guy was sitting right in front of me, and we showed a video of him. How do we deal with this? How are we going to detect this? What's our processes?
Yeah. So even maybe before we get into provenance, which is a major investment for Google, for the ecosystem, like we think it's such an important lever. There's also, I think, this trade-off between what all the AI labs are willing to generate versus the distribution risk. And so I think what's really important is, like, if you just think about some of the deep fakes that have been highlighted associated with the Iran war, for instance, right? Like, if you're a model developer, like, your question is, okay, I'm concerned about these deep fakes, but do I want to restrict generation of any potential image or video that could be weaponized as a deep fake related to that conflict? And I think what's really important for people who are like really developing the technology is that you could have a great policy on paper, but if you can't technically implement that policy in a way that feels coherent, you could all of a sudden have a model that is severely hamstrung. So as an example, Google might say we won't be willing to generate an image of US soldiers surrendering to Iranian forces, but you could just slightly generalize that query to, okay, soldiers surrendering to other soldiers in a nondescript city with a mosque in the background. And all of a sudden, that can be weaponized as Iranian deepfake. So as model developers, like, we're constantly asking these questions around what are we willing to generate, acknowledging that if we draw our lines in the wrong place, like, it can make it overly restrictive. And there's obviously creative use cases, other use cases that really just become problematic. So then the question is, like, distribution. And so if you're sort of, the models are maybe more permissive in terms of willing to generate sort of images that could be weaponized as deepfakes, what do you do on the distribution side when these images are posted on X, where they're on Reddit, where they are potentially on YouTube? And that's where provenance becomes absolutely so critical. And I know that you heard from Andy earlier, I mentioned, Google has its own proprietary provenance technical solution. It's called SynthID. We mark up every piece of image or every image generated or video that's generated or audio via our models now have SynthID, and you can verify SynthID by uploading a piece of content to the Gemini app, search now, and say, is this AI? And we will be able to detect SynthID and be able to tell you this is AI or not. The challenge is that's within the four corners of Google, but like, deepfakes is an all-of ecosystem, all-of industry approach. And so if Google is able to mark up its content, but other labs are not marking up their content, or if we're able to detect deepfakes, but other distribution ecosystems, information ecosystems are not, then you've only solved for a slice. And so that's why this is an area where there's so much industry collaboration. I think we are also part of C2PA. Like, all of our products are adopting C2PA. It's really important metadata that has the benefit of being an industry standard. We're really excited about that. We're also talking about, can we sort of make SynthID adoption wider than Google as well? I think that's also really important for us. And so, so I think, if these models, and, it's not just Google models, it's, and not just even the major players, but also the, labs that are in China and other places that are willing to allow all sorts of generation, we really have to think about, okay, then how do we protect users on the distribution side? And first and foremost, make them understand that if they're being exposed to a piece of content, they're able to very, very easily verify that it's AI generated or not. And we can go on a whole other tangent around, like, labels and visible labels. A lot of regulation is calling for that, but that's its own ecosystem of complexity when it comes to, like, what's the right way of also proactively providing literacy to users. There's a lot of research about label blindness, or, like, labels being confusing. There's the liar's dilemma. Again, we could have a whole conference on.
Well, I certainly do want us to step out of roles and ask what the policy aspect should be and how we could do that and get thoughts on that. But Dave, you're mentioning SynthID, and I'm not a SynthID expert, but I think that in every picture nowadays, you can upload them to Google and say, hey, just fix my lighting on this. I am a amateur photographer, and so I'm like, oh, maybe I don't want to go in a Lightroom and I just want to adjust something. Does that make it an AI-generated picture that SynthID says is AI-generated?
So these are great. These are like the detailed questions that if if you're working for one of these generation, companies or just be like, we are asking these questions, like what's the degree of editing that would make, us, for instance, have a label around like this was made by AI. And these are very, very tricky questions, because it could be a very small benign edit. Or let's say it's a video and you have a 1 hour video, it's got 20 seconds of AI content. Is that an AI video or is that a non-AI video? So there's real questions around that. And then also as you're editing content, there's also a question around, are these technical solutions, are they robust enough for that? So this is why, like, honestly, we're not a big fan of visible watermarks. On the surface, it can be like, okay, it's got that little thing on the right corner that lets you know that it's AI generated or not. But it's so easy to crop that. Anybody can do it. Or it's so easy to also inversely add that to an image that's real to then, again, create that liar's dividend and make it seem like, oh, this is actually not true. This was just an AI generated. So SynthID has a lot of robustness in terms of tampering and editing an image. But yeah, there's a lot of questions around how do these solutions ensure editing, but then also, again, what's the right level of editing that warrants these provenance solutions, and how do we make that clear to users?
I feel like if a photo adds a little bit of hair to me, that's not artificially generated. That's just good editing. Wasim, if I come to you, so Dave's talking to us about different ways of identifying this and essentially protections around these deep fakes and how do we inform the public on that. How do you think of what we should be doing and what we should be striving for, whether it's something you're already working on or some strive the company should be thinking about?
I can actually jump off exactly what you were saying there. So first, yes, it's a really difficult problem that I think all of the frontier models, companies that are building frontier models, both from the perspective of liability and having that technology needs to have these kind of proofing mechanisms, right? That being said, for every single frontier model that puts those solutions in place, there's 20 other models somewhere on the dark web that have a lot of capability, and they're designed for individuals who want to do harm with it or create a narrative attack or a campaign. So you're never going to get rid of this problem of like, how do we cut off the source by, good meaning companies putting those technologies in place, because there's always an alternative, right? And so this notion of being able to understand whether or not something is synthetic imagery or a deep fake, at least from our perspective, the way our teams work and the way we build our technology, we started doing this about 2 years ago, assume everything is synthetic, right? The assumption has to be that everything is synthetic because, like we were just saying, if everybody's going to be modifying an image, even processing it just to make it a little bit better, and technically it's synthetic media, right? It's been put through a model. So we assume everything on the internet is synthetic. And then what ends up being important is, one, from a KYC perspective or from identity management perspective, where are the humans? Because again, like if you've heard of dead internet theory, it's basically that, maybe even 50% of maybe the internet is already AI generated. In a couple of years, maybe it'll be 99% generated at the rate with which AI and agents are creating content. So it used to be about us being able to detect where are the bots. Now it's going to be where are the humans, and being able to understand how to message the humans. You were at RSA last week, so it was all agentic security, right? So the issue becomes agents will outweigh or outnumber humans by 1,000-fold on the internet, whether that's social media or just internet at large. So you have to assume everything is synthetic. And the most important component then is, what is the dominant message perception narrative? Because agents are designed to flood the zone or will be designed to flood the zone with all manners of content and imagery. So being able to then detect that and understand what is likely swaying the public, swaying the public, it's not just the average person or audience member anymore. It could be members of Congress. It could be the CEOs of companies. It could be your board members. So whether it's like internal comms or external comms, they're all living in this world that is being essentially bathed in points of view that are maybe driven by nation states, domestic actors, short sellers, all equipped by thousands of agents. So I don't want to go too far into this and make it all doomsday here, but there's kind of a bit of a reckoning. One thing I noticed last week at RSA, and these are like people who are supposed to be safeguarding organizations, every CISO threat intel team. They don't know what the hell they're going to do about this right now. The rate with which vulnerability is increasing, they're just getting steamrolled on all of these security decisions, right? Like it's the CEO, it is the teams that are deploying this technology, they're just diving straight into it. So everybody knows we're moving too fast to prevent these vulnerabilities. Nobody wants to be the one that's not adopting AI. Nobody wants to be the slowest one to the party. And so for the next 2 years, it's going to be serious catch-up on synthetic media and agents across entire Fortune 500 and even the whole of government that are integrating these technologies. So it's going to be an interesting 2 years, for sure.
Can I just ask that question on that? Because I'm just trying to follow.
Yeah.
So is your view that, like, if you think about, folks that are responsible for information ecosystems, like, there's no future state where you have healthy information ecosystems and it's all going to be synthetically generated content, no ability to discern authenticity from AI generated, and so we're all like doomed in terms of trying to find veracity and truthfulness. I'm just trying to understand.
I'll tell
'Cause
you.
we definitely don't believe that.
Yeah,
at Google. It's
I
like
think
core to our business.
Yeah, I think.
It is our mission.
Yeah, I think like communities are getting more fragmented and insular, right? So you see, especially like I have a young daughter and she doesn't trust AI, and it's kind of funny. She actually is okay with AI, but she's not okay with the operators. She doesn't trust the humans operating the AI, and she's 8 years old. And so I think one of the reasons people are going into, say, private Discord channels, private communities, private servers, especially if I think about like the next generation, even seeing like younger kids, like my cousins and whatnot, they don't trust social media. They don't trust anything online. They don't trust anything on any of the platforms. They go to like, where's my trusted community? They're the old-fashioned ones, kind of. They're going back to like, here's my peer group. And then right now, I don't see controls in place that are going to prevent the internet from being flooded. Moderation has been almost reduced to just a mere like kind of shadow of what it used to be across the platform, say 4 or 5 years ago. And I'm just saying the next year or two is going to be kind of the defining factor of whether or not the internet is overrun by agentic content. Yeah, it's a bit of a doomy view, and we all can't make the decision unless all the companies work together to make that decision, right? You see little points of contention, right? Like when Cloudflare says, "Hey, okay, we're going to either let LLMs scrape the internet at large, or you're going to pay us for the ability to scrape at large." Like these kind of blanket decisions that can affect the entire internet. Outside of that, I think it's going to be the decisions that everybody makes. In terms of provenance and authenticity over the next maybe even year, But,
Dave, I don't want you to not get a rebuttal here.
yeah.
He's talking about the end of Google. I don't want you to not have.
I'm just sensitive
That
to
is not my
other
intention.
questions and stuff. But no, I mean,
love
we
Google.
have a much more optimistic view. I mean, it's our mission, right? Is to organize the world's information and make it. If the world's information is not trusted and it's slop, then, I mean, Google doesn't need to exist. And so we are investing a ton in this space. Like, your point around content moderation, our trust and safety team is bigger than it's ever been. We have more people focused on this space. And, we're also
Do you think that others
I'm more talking about
also
the social
do?
media platforms.
I mean, I think also like I'm talking about like information ecosystems where we have a lot of content generators within, but I also think about news publishers and there's obviously challenges with that industry, but we do think that there's really high quality, authentic content that's out there, and there's ranking, algorithmic solutions for that, making sure that you're elevating. And this is what Google's been doing for many, many years, right? Like elevating high quality information, down ranking low quality information, removing information that's clearly harmful. That's like our bread and butter. And so I don't disagree that there's challenges on the horizon, but I think that you have a lot of people that are invested in making sure that there is still healthy information ecosystems for many years to come, even in a world of agents and even in a world of distrust in institutions and.
I just want to say, like, we are one of those companies. Like, we have an optimistic view of the future.
No,
If
disagree
all-
more.
If all of the ecosystem starts working together, but the biggest organizations out there are a little bit disincentivized to do some of the things that we're talking about.
Well,
A lot of
I
people in
do,
this room
I want to
are
get to
opposed.
David and talk a little bit about regulation, but I do think we had a question.
A quick question. Drawing the distinction between generative and agentic, I know that's what we're focusing on. I guess I, to some degree, struggle with the concept of human in the loop and what the role is. Particularly, number one, because agentic, by definition, is supposed to be relatively autonomous. So the question is, what is the role of the expert, the human individual? And then it's supposed to work at breakneck speed. So at what point does the human individual kind of interject his or their perspective or control governance on the decision that's being made? I want to just get a perspective on how you guys.
I could give you just one thing of how we think about it. So we use a lot of agentic teams ourselves, and we work with a lot of teams that use our technology as reasoning guardrails for their agentic teams. And we think of it as the human on the loop. It's kind of like a hypervisor versus like an advisor to that team. But that's just the way in which everyone is going. When people say, okay, we're going to get rid of 50 team members and replace them with agents, right? There still has to be someone on the loop making those key decisions. It's like adjustments or refinements, or they're doing something wrong. So that's
I would just also add, I have a group of about 3,500 investigators globally that are looking through all different fraud alerts, anti-money laundering alerts, sanctions, anything like that. You, at this stage of where the technology is, if you're regulated, right, I'll just kind of throw that out there in a very big way, you can't just turn it all over to the agents, at this point. One, the technology is just not there in terms of accuracy to, first of all, turn it all over. Second of all, you have to have model governance that's overlooking and overseeing all of what you're looking to deploy, and make sure that that is statistically sound and that you're able to explain that to a regulator. So will that come in 6 months, 9 months, a year? Maybe. But as of where we are right now, that is not enough to do, what is being suggested. We've seen some other institutions do that and say, we're going to get rid of all these people because the technology is there. I think that's wrong. That's not where it is right now, although you have to aggressively figure out how you're going to integrate it into your processes right now in lots of really exciting ways. Just back to the point you two were making in the good debate that you were having, I was sitting here on the edge watching that because I have to watch what you two are doing, because at the end of the day, it's functions like mine, also kind of a trusted safety function where we do the brand risk management, work as well. If a company is putting its PayPal button or its watermark or whatever on any of these products that are being launched, whether it's a direct partnership with a Google or a place where your brand is, you really have to think about the ethics and the morality of what is surrounding this, because, for example, the child sexual assault material image that could be created as a result of what we are discussing here today puts your brand tremendously at risk. Not only that, it's what image is being utilized to actually create that, right? That's the really interesting and horrifying in many ways potential outcome of where we are with the technology and where it's existing. So those controls that you're talking about are so critical, and the partners that are willing to adopt them and willing to kind of think about that in the way are the partnerships that are going to advance this in a much more responsible way.
And David, let me come to you back in a minute. Let me get to the regulatory question. Where are we on regulations right now? And/or where should we be on regulations?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to necessarily offer the opinion on where we should be because of, I speak for myself, not PayPal. But look, where we are is everybody's trying to figure this out, right? I think that's very much where we are. I mean, you've seen some bespoke states in the United States try to introduce legislation that has caused a whole lot of potential angst. We've obviously seen the federal government come in and want to sponsor this in a really big way. And then in Europe, you are seeing much more, I think, thought on how content moderation should be modified in this space and what this should look like, responsibly, which is where we're really seeing much of that, of the guardrails from a European perspective being put on at least a global company. So I do think it's around the parameters of what we've been talking about, at least from where I sit, which is what is the content moderation around it, and how then do you institute controls? The regulators do have a lot of power here to actually put guardrails on, even without specific legislation being launched. And I think that's where at least I'm seeing a lot of the pressure come in, because when the deepfakes are being launched, regulators are coming in and asking questions about it, and they're asking about your controls around it. So I do think that's where at least I will see a lot of the tightening and the content
Look,
moderation area.
I love that, Dave. I was very impressed, frankly, by your position of we need this to be realistic or nobody's going to trust our service anymore. So maybe, I mean, that's a good the kind of laissez-faire view of government. We don't even need them. We'll self-regulate or we won't exist.
No, I mean, Google is in favor of regulation that makes sense. Actually, I think it does a really nice job of setting standards, which are really important in some of these spaces. But I'll give you an example. Like, so India just launched a law around, deepfakes. SG, I'm blanking on the acronym, but it was launched and then went into effect immediately. And so now we're scrambling to figure out what does that mean? Was intent, EU code of practice, and I think what we're really trying to do is just make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what we think the durable solutions are. I gave the example of visible watermarks. It's tempting to be oh, and again, we all want the same goals, right? We're having this conference for a reason, similar conferences all around the world. Everybody's concerned around deepfakes. We deeply are concerned about, weaponization of information. But it's just there can be these knee-jerk reactions to let's have that little sparkle in the right-hand corner, and that's going to solve the problem. But again, it could just make things worse. If it's very tamper-prone. Again, if you can add it, then it also, again, allows you to weaponize authentic information. And so that's what we're really concerned about is just with industry, with government, making sure that we're all sort of moving in the same direction in terms of what sensible regulation really looks like.
And I would just add a quick point to that. By launching one particular standard, one, do they know whether it's possible to even navigate that standard and put in the right controls to deal with it? And then two, you're starting to create different standards throughout the world or in different markets that then you have to meet. And how do you create one program that can actually do that? That is the other piece here, that it's going to roll out and you're going to have to react and adjust to each one.
And I want to come back to that. Yes.
Okay, this is quick. The FBI, when they meet an 18-year-old high schooler, and who's a very good computer programmer, they say, you go in prison or you work for us. So what about making assets of these people all over the world, assets to your company? You either work for us or you go in prison for the rest of your life.
I hope they're not doing that, but I like the question of how are we using today's hackers and youth who have these great skill sets to combat these issues. Are you seeing kind of the next generation helping us combat this or embracing this?
I mean, I can say we have, it's not quite a direct answer to that question, but we do have things like vulnerability reward programs, bug bounty programs. You can get very significant rewards for finding vulnerabilities in our code, especially security vulnerabilities. They're structured in a way where we don't want this deluge of people being we don't like this thing that Gemini was able to generate, because then again, you could lose the signal and the noise. But that is a way of both detecting vulnerabilities, but also frankly meeting some of these people who are just amazing hackers who really understand technology and beginning to develop a relationship. I don't have stats in terms of if any, how many of those converted to Google employees, but there's a lot of people, especially who I work with, that don't have traditional backgrounds, that just love technology, love trying to break technology and red team technology, that are great hires for an organization like Trust and Safety.
Some of them rather work for you for your money than work for the NSA, CIA. They say CIA and NSA is paid six figures. You guys pay more than the CIA and NSA.
I think there's always going to be that balance. Being a former government person, there's always that balance between what government can do and then what the private sector can pay. I think the key thing here, though, is how do you want to recruit the right talent in to actually ingest what people are now growing up with versus some folks in the job market who don't have that experience. So one, I think it's about adapting your current employee base to the technology, and then two, it's actually then integrating folks in who are now kind of native AI users and thinking about it that way. I think that is also a huge challenge in terms of workforces, especially if you're in a public company that is navigating lots of employees and lots of attacks. It's how do you think about turning your employee base as well?
Dave, I thought your comment, your lawyers have done a good job, because you said we are in favor of reasonable regulation. Very nice.
I'm in global affairs. So my manager reports to Ken Walker.
Fantastic. So let's talk about that, because you also raised, and I thought it was a very interesting discussion, about whether it's the generation of AI that we should be looking at or how it's distributed. and maybe we step outside of our roles and talk a little bit of what is the right approach. Should we be regulating the generation of deepfakes? Is that even a possibility? Or are we going to be doing content moderation by regulation?
I mean, my sense is that regulators have looked at things like generation, and they've frankly been asking the very same questions that we ask internally, which is, where do you draw the line? And this is honestly also why, like, I really deeply love my work and my org, is that, you know, you can theorize about things all you want, but at the end of the day, like, somebody has to define a line, and that line has to be implemented in a way that is fair and consistent across all of our surfaces. And so we don't have the luxury of, like, again, writing a sentence, you know, do not generate deepfakes related to an interstate conflict that could sow discord among those involved. We have to actually think about how do you actually have a model understand potential safeguards, limitations that that model will understand in a whole variety of different contexts, right? Not just the Iranian war, but any geopolitical conflict. How do you draw the line? How do you define what that is? And so I think regulators have, you know, I'm sure they're asking them the same questions as us, which is why we've seen a lot of regulation in this space sort of lean towards things like provenance, because provenance is something where, again, provenance is not a slam dunk either in terms of what the right solutions are, but I think everybody can agree that it's really important for users, regardless of where they're connecting with information, to be able to have the opportunity to understand this is AI generated or not, and focus on info literacy. And also, a lot of regulation is focused on transparency. They want to understand what model developers, AI labs are actually doing. But when it comes to the generation policies, again, it's just really tricky to get the line right. But just as an example, we have a whole bunch of gnarly elections ahead of us this year, especially as we look towards the latter half of the year. I think there's some really tricky questions around, should you be able to generate images of candidates in elections, you know, within an election cycle? But then again, it goes questions about, well, how down ballot do you go? How do you define like what that cycle looks like? And then you can end up in a world where it's like, okay, you're not, you know, from a technical implementation standpoint, you have a policy that ends up preventing the generation of any elected official, which has a lot of challenges in terms of constraining the helpfulness when, you know, you think about candidates that don't have the same campaign war chest that other campaigns do. They want to use AI to get their message out and stuff. So there's a lot of those type of trade-offs that we're navigating. I think key opinion formers, like regulators, are also asking these same questions. And again, if they define lines that are different than our own, I think we welcome that opportunity to have that iterative process with them. We have a lot of teams at Google that are working to sort of inform regulations, make sure they make sense. But again, like, we're not opposed to regulation. If there's somebody outside of Google that comes up with a line that really makes a lot of sense that we should consider, we're not averse to that.
Okay, I have so many questions on that. I mean, if we have regulations around the generation, is that something that affects Google, or is that affecting those who are using Google's services to display that? But I want to turn to cyber risks and AI. Wasim, why don't I start with you on this one? With the advent of these deep fakes, how should organizations be treating this? Is it just another nexus or step in the world of cyber risks that we're all trying to govern?
I'll answer that in a second, but I will just give my hot take opinion on the regulatory framework.
Oh, please.
Which is, well, I mean, so I don't have all that much confidence in the regulatory frameworks in general, because what you're really going to end up with, and this has always been the case, war on terror, war on drugs, war against drunk driving, whatever it is, these things are going to continue to happen even if you make examples of organizations or people time to time, right? It's kind of like a sweeping the beach, right? Like, or you know, when you take a counterfeiter out, you know, just 10 more pop up, you know, overseas to replace them. All you can do is make an example of it. But the problem is, like, with this particular type of technology, making an example out of the perpetrators are really, really difficult. It could be an individual. They could be using 10 different tools that belong to 10 different companies. And so all you can really do is say, okay, we have enforced this on this particular person. And I go back to like 2018, 2019, Singapore passed the first disinformation takedown laws called POFMA. When they actually went to enforce that, it was exceedingly hard to make any kind of real prosecutions or takedowns because of how ephemeral the actual evidence chain was. So to us, we think about how do you create like an evidentiary chain when it comes to something like a deepfake or disinformation, so that you can actually, with confidence, say this is the thing that we actually want to enforce and make public, so people are turned off from trying to go about and do that again. So sorry, digression, but I would say on the cyber risk component of it, I would kind of zoom out a little bit. So we're in this kind of period of geo-economic confrontation and geopolitical risk, unlike the likes of which we've probably lived through for the most part, at least unlike I have ever lived through. And so this geo-economic confrontation, what ultimately ends up happening is, whether it's a nation state, domestic actor, they are using these kinds of technologies, deepfakes, disinformation, narrative attacks, to create some sort of outsized economic harm to Fortune 500s and Global 2000s, because companies more and more often today become a lightning rod through which a very specific point is made through. So something happens overseas to a hospital, medical infrastructure gets hit in the US, as an example, right? Just pulling from the recent news. So it is a cybersecurity concern, threat intelligence concern. It's a board level concern to understand these kinds of risks, because a single perpetrator, where the cost of technology is going down every week or every month, can do what only a nation state had access to just 3-4 years ago when we were still in the operating space. I've been in a warehouse where there's 20,000 cell phones all programmed to create discourse and create societal discord. I've seen those rooms are taken down. The FBI confiscates one of these farms every couple of years, massive takedowns around it. Today, you can do that same kind of narrative attack or information operation using a laptop and 10, 20,000 agents. And those are occurring now, like they're happening right now, not sci-fi future, it's happening today. So if the Fortune 500s, the Global 2000s, governments don't actually take this level of threat seriously, then I don't think they understand the kind of ramifications that are happening every day today. It's not like some far-off future kind of Skynet type situation that's going to happen down the road. We see it happening every day. So I think it's got to be a board level, C-suite level concern across all key operations, from M&A to threat intelligence. Executive protection is another thing we address. Narrative risk to executive protection. Something happens in one industry, suddenly you need to go from green to red across maybe 12 CEOs, and industry doesn't see it coming. So I think we've kind of just like scratched the surface on how much risk all of these technologies being unleashed on a public that doesn't know how to perceive and understand reality anymore based on what we're all used to seeing. We get our news in digital media. So our brains aren't really meant to process the kind of information that we get inundated with. And so we need detection mechanisms, and we need whole of society to make real changes on how do we protect the public? How do we protect from these kind of godlike technologies that have been unleashed on us in a period of almost overnight? So that's really what I hope the ecosystem at large starts gathering together and thinking for the greater good. Right?
Very good. Not quite uplifting, but very good. It's scary, your point, and I think you're 100% right? That now somebody with a laptop can do what these rooms did in this disinformation campaigns, and how
I
easy
will say
that
one
is.
thing. The light at the end of the tunnel is Congress has passed a bill to, like, say, define cognitive warfare, budget it, through the U.S. Army, like see it as a core threat, just like cyber operations and things of that nature. And at RSA, just a slew of companies that are like in the defender mindset right now. Even venture capital that never used to put money into these kinds of use cases in national security, defender mindset. And so, me being, I have a number of startups in my life. This is the first one that was mission focused, greater good. But it's good to see that, because 5 years ago, that was not the case whatsoever. And today we're seeing that. So there is a fairly strong light at the end of the tunnel, because the same technologies that the adversaries are using are available to all of the people in defender mentality. So, it is an AI versus AI arms race, but, both sides of them are equipped. So that's a good thing.
So, David, we're painting some tough pictures here, which I frankly, I hate to say, I agree with. People accuse me as a cyber guy of often painting doom and gloom, and I think the agentic AI and these deep fakes are only going to exacerbate this situation. You're in a company that has to deal with this. How do you get, we heard, oh, sometimes executives are only going to pay attention when they hear about the problems of other companies or their own. How do we deal with this? What kind of mechanisms internally?
Yeah, well, look, the doom and gloom, I get, we are at a moment, right? I just want to zoom out for a second also, though. We've been at other moments, right? This is obviously a torrent at one moment, but everybody will find a moment here to catch up. And I think that is also why the point about how you use AI to combat AI is really important, as well as we navigate what strategies we're going to use as bigger companies. Look, I think inside a financial institution like PayPal or any company that is out there, you have some immediate markers that get the board's attention, that get the risk committee's attention, that get your C-suite's attention, which is, for us, a loss number, right? There's a fraud loss element that exists if you're a financial institution that is really important to watch. So, getting back to the point that Dave was making about investing heavily, when you understand that you have to harden your defenses, in these places to make sure that you can keep your company functioning and keep customer trust, right? This is like two-pronged because the company itself is getting hit and there's a loss number that's associated with that. But then there's also that reverberation as your customers get hit and affected by this, you lose customer trust. Both of those things are really damaging. So you're taking a loss and your brand is getting hit at the same time. Is that customer going to come back to you or not? By the way, Google gets hit at that also because if the image was being created using Gemini, then they're also, on the hook for this. So I think everybody gets the moment, right? Because the moment is really important. The question really is across big corporations that have a lot of different risk functions, whether it's, the CISO sitting here, the chief risk officer sitting there, the chief compliance officer sitting here, the financial crime guy running across, how do you actually bring together, that tabletop? So you have all the right stakeholders sitting at the table. How do you then program manage this through, get the right funding, the right resourcing that is not going to be cut in a moment and keep that funding, all the way through and resource so you're innovating through this moment? That to me is actually the key here. It's organization. And then you have to spot the right vendors, the right partners, the right opportunities to integrate those in. It's a big moment, but it is also achievable if you're recognizing it and you get the right support. I think good institutions are going in front of their boards right now saying, we want to talk to you in a training session about how we see AI as a risk. We want your support as we go out and try to figure this out, and we're going to report in a cadence back to you on how we're integrating this into our everyday.
Just to build on something that you said, actually, like this is your first mission-driven startup. Like, I will say also, like the people that are working in this space right now across all of our companies and beyond, like these are some of the most mission-driven people that you've met. And, this is why maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic than it seems like several of you, which is, yes, like the technical frontier is accelerating at a blistering pace, right? It's not just agentic. We have personalized agents, right? Advanced tool use. Like these are sort of unprecedented frontiers with technology and autonomy, but you have some of the smartest people in the world that are thinking about all the risks, that are trying to get ahead of things. The defender's dilemma, as you all mentioned, using AI to get ahead of AI. And I think that's sort of what keeps me optimistic, is just sort of seeing, like all of you are here at this conference talking about deepfakes. Like you're interested in these societal issues and you want to get ahead of these things and make sure that this technology is maximizing opportunity while we're minimizing risk. And so, if this is interesting, we should,
I don't want to be accused too much of being a cynic or a pessimist over where we are.
Likewise.
But what's that?
Likewise.
Yeah, but here comes my pessimism. It does seem like maybe as I said, kudos to you, kudos to Google if your answer is, look, no one's going to believe us and go to Google if no one believes the content that's out there. I won't mention other company names, but I feel like other places make a lot of money by deepfakes. Right, and for them it's been an advantage, and they see that someone likes this kind of stream, and if their deep fake hits them, then they're going to make even more money off of that, and so that creates a very different incentive to me. And I don't want this because I think it'll be the end of so much of the internet. Content moderation and putting liability on providers and social media would maybe create a little more responsibility around this, but it's very dangerous, very dangerous. We saw even hints of that by by an administration say don't put out something, and how that reverberates, and what does that mean for really censorship? I don't know if you all have thoughts on my crazy comment on do we eventually need something like that in liability on providers? Is that our only way out of this, or will others have the view that Dave's espousing here? You can plead the fifth, it's fine. I mean, I'm the moderator, I'll just keep asking the question.
No, I mean, I get just what we were talking about earlier. Like, regulation is not a bad thing. Good, like well thought out, well reasoned regulation by people who are thinking deeply about these things could be necessary, is necessary in certain areas, and so we welcome it.
Yes, I was going to say open to some other questions. Yes.
So, yeah, I agree, like everybody here is very optimistic and that's great, but I feel like I'm hearing there's still a lot of reaction to this than being proactive in general out there. So I'm just asking the question, is that what I'm getting out of this?
I would just quickly answer, at least from where we sit. We're being really proactive with it. The problem is that you have to be reactive in the proactive. Just because you don't know what's hitting you every day and the way in which the technology is developing, there's so many new pieces that are coming at you that you have to react to. So I do think part of this, and again, I come at this from like a very programmatic place. You have to set up, a program that is going to be able to adjust and fight this. How do you programmatically become proactive with this? But at the same way, you have to have the tools and techniques to react to the moment, because that proactivity then will help you. So I don't know if you're following my thread here, but I think it's both that you really have to have. And if you're sitting there just being reactive, you've lost.
I mean, this is where governance is so important. That's a big part of my team's focus is for every launch, we actually have multiple checkpoints, whether it's being clear on what responsibility looks like in terms of requirements, different launch reviews with different levels of executives. And so that is a way of, before something ever launches into the wild, like we're asking ourselves, what are the risks that this launch represents? What are the inherent risks? What are the things that we've done via mitigations, via training that reduces those risks, and sort of what's left? And so that's governance pre-launch, but then equally important is once something launches, we are trying to get a read in terms of how users are going to use these things. But one of the things that I think is so important for model developers, AI product, folks that are launching AI products is also looking at logs, like what are users actually doing and obsessing over those logs right after a launch, 30 days, 90 days, to understand what's the emerging user behavior that we might not have thought about in advance of a launch, or as we're going through these governance checkpoints. And then once we detect potentially emerging user behavior that's problematic, how do we rapidly iterate our protections to make sure that if users are doing something that's potentially problematic, we can just have that feedback loop back into the product and ultimately the model.
It just occurred to me, it's like Google and PayPal, so you know what they do. So from the perspective of Blackbird, we really do provide a technology platform for public sector, private sector clients to understand narrative attacks, disinformation, deepfakes, how it spreads, how it impacts those organizations. So we are a technology company. And so I would just be able to offer this perspective that over the last 5 years, the posture of who we sell to and how they use our product has changed drastically, particularly in the last 12 months. So when we first started, our only customers were national security. They're the only ones who really understood information and operations writ large and were willing to actually look at platforms for that. Fortune 500s were not thinking about this problem in 2017, 18, 19. In 2021 is when we saw strategic comms and crisis comms and risk officers start to want to understand this better. How is this impacting everything from customer marketing campaigns that could be sideswiped across by some sort of narrative to executive protection? And now we're seeing cybersecurity. The last 6 months, the CISOs, the threat intelligence teams have seriously started looking at the space because they understand that they are the only ones equipped to handle nation-state adversaries that are sitting swivel chair to cyber attacks who are also doing narrative attacks. It's not going to be the person who's on Cision, like pushing out press releases, like the comms teams that are going to handle these kinds of adversaries. And so I will say the number one thing I see that is really, really heartening is these organizations that frankly never even talk to each other internally, comms and the CISOs, they're not really joined at the hip in most organizations. They're starting to create fusion centers and fusing intelligence between crisis comms and threat intelligence in a lot of our own engagements. And that pulls in attention from other teams, like legal, like M&A, legal in particular, legal, public affairs and legal have been more involved in coming to the table, sometimes even on first, second, or third discussions with the company that we may be talking to, and they were never on the scene prior. And so the level of attention from customers themselves that we have seen are absolutely proactive, whereas 5 years ago, they wait to get hit with something and then they're scrambling and we're helping them with an active event, right? Still about, I would still say that's about 70% of our customers, reactive. For us, like 30% of them coming proactive is actually a really high number compared to just a couple of years ago.
Yes.
A number of you have mentioned the RSA conference, number one, and number two, also the reducing cost of technology that are allowing cyber criminals to access this technology, use it criminally, and remove barriers, if you will, for them to enter this space. I read an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal Cyber Pro edition that mentioned that there's a whole host of irony here that these developments will now be starting to dissuade young professionals from entering the profession, right, as cyber professionals and technologists to defend, right, against these criminals. Any thoughts on that? And this is being seen with the advent of the increase in AI, right? It's also being seen in universities, for example. Princeton University's computer science school has a plummeting enrollment rate. Is there any thoughts on it? All of you obviously have tremendous passion for what you're doing. But is there any concern about the younger professionals that are now going to be avoiding the industry because of AI and these developments?
I mean, it's a really interesting question. I can hop in if you want. Or the way it's interesting because the way I see it actually has been very different. In that we need more technologists, we need more people who understand the technology, who are willing to work with us, which is the conundrum I think you're probably kind of getting at. But what we've seen is a real interest. Those are the roles actually that we have to fill, right? Those are the positions that we're looking to fill, is competent people who understand the technology, want to grow with the technology inside of our company. So we have seen a real interest and need for these kinds of programs and folks coming out of it. And that special skill, I think, is just going to be needed more and more as we navigate, updating where are we from a technology perspective. So it's interesting. I'll have to look at what you were reading, but I'm seeing the opposite. There's such a glaring need for it, and the roles are there for it.
I mean, personally, I think it's kind of like when we went from hardware to software. So all of the people who are passionate about hardware had to learn that, like, okay, where it's at is software engineering, and now it's more around, what kind of skills do you need to thrive in an AI-driven, agentic world. I think the jury's out on whether or not agents will actually replace people in the job market, because I will say, the frontier models, if they don't sell the story that, agents are going to replace people, it's really hard to get those valuations to let them buy those data centers. So that's just my take on it. Like, you have to have a product. Same thing with robotics, right? Like, if it's not replacing everyone, then it's really hard to justify the kind of money that they're raising from investors to actually drive the build out of that infrastructure, right? So no one really knows if it's actually going to happen, but that's the objective, though, right? I mean, certainly their objective. We'll see how it plays out.
Dave, last word?
Yeah, I wasn't expecting anything to say. I wasn't expecting to answer this question because I thought that they both did a nice job. But I just on the point around frontier models, like making the pitch that machines are always going to replace humans, like that is not the Google belief. And I don't think actually many of the major AI labs would be saying that. Like, we always think that there's a role for humans and technology to both play vital roles. I think it's more what Dave was saying, which is that, like, we see AI, even very, very powerful agents, as an augmentation, as an assist, but there's still a vital role for humans in the loop, especially in some of these sensitive areas that we've all been discussing.
I'm delighted with that optimistic note, and the Terminator era is not yet here. I want to thank this fantastic panel, and thank you very much. Amazing.